Good afternoon. Welcome back to Medical Grand Rounds. This is our monthly session on COVID. I'm Bob Wachter, Chair of the Department of Medicine at UCSF. Just an announcement for our viewers at UCSF. Next week, we will be back to doing in-person sessions. It will be in the first floor of the brand new C building. There will be food, phones, Apex access, all the things you need. You will still be able to watch by video if you choose, but it'd be great to see at least some of you in person if you're game. And next week's session will be Pamela talking about tobacco control issues. Sorry about that. I just got corrected. Next week will be an HSW 300. We'll be moving to the new room a little bit later. So we'll send that out to everybody soon. So let's turn to today's session. I'm incredibly excited about it. We have two of my heroes in the world of COVID speaking with us. The first is Caitlin Rivers. Caitlin is the founding associate director of the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the CDC. She's there on loan from the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, where she's assistant professor in the departments of environmental health and engineering at the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She focuses on public health preparedness and response, particularly improving capabilities in the field of outbreak science and modeling to support decision making. And I've had a chance to chat with Caitlin several times over the course of the pandemic, and she's incredibly thoughtful and instructive. So look forward to speaking with her. And in addition, we have my old friend Zeke Emanuel. Zeke is the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives, the Diane and Robert Levy University Professor, and co-director of the Health Transformation Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. From 2009 to 11, he was special advisor for health policy to the director of the Office and Management and Budget in the Obama White House. From 1997 to 2011, he was chair of the Department of Bioethics at the NIH, and he also served as a member of the Biden COVID-19 transition team. Zeke has written and edited 15 books and over 300 scientific articles. He's a regular guest on CNN and MSNBC and often publishes pieces in the Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. Over the past 2 years, those pieces, some of his writings in the medical literature and a lot of his behind-the-scenes work have had an enormous influence on COVID health policy. So let me have both of them on there. Hi, Caitlin, and hi, Zeke. Thank you for joining us. So format-wise, the first half or so, I'm going to spend much of my time with Caitlin, but Zeke will chime in and we'll have some questions for him as well. And then we'll turn to broader matters of health policy and focus mostly with Zeke, although Caitlin will stay on as well. So thank you both for joining us today. So let's get started. Caitlin, let me give you a chance to do a little advertising. Talk about this new center. What is it designed to do? And what got you excited enough about it to join the effort?
Yeah, thanks. So I am visiting today from the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We are a brand new center at CDC. We were founded in an executive order, actually, on President Biden's first full day in office, and we received funding in the American Rescue Plan. So brand new. Our mission is really to use data and analytics and modeling to support outbreak response. It will be a very operational capability, very focused on making sure that we're meeting the needs of decision makers, which, yes, will include the CDC director and public health officials, but it will also grow to include the public. So you all will eventually be able to use it as a resource to guide your own decision making as individuals. And we're really looking forward to continuing to grow. I'll give a little plug for an event that we're putting on April 19th at the White House, which will be live streamed. When I get a minute, I'll put it in the chat to make available to everyone. But that'll be a whole 2.5 hours to be able to talk about what we're trying to do and to hear from the people who we're hoping to serve with this effort. So I hope that some of you will be able to join us on April 19th.
Great. It's very exciting. I guess as an interested layperson, I would have expected the CDC would have had such a thing before. So why not? And what is this bringing together, designed to replace or integrate? Sort of, why haven't we had such a thing before?
CDC does and has always used data and analytics to inform outbreak response, but there is a new horizon with modeling and with more advanced analytics. Now, certainly even that has been happening at CDC, but when there is an emergency, when there's a public health crisis, it's really been the responsibility of academics to provide that surge capacity. So when the needs grow beyond what CDC subject matter experts can provide, it's been volunteer academics who have been the ones to step in and support. But we've seen over the years that the demand for modeling and analytics has grown so much that we can't run it like that anymore. We really need to institutionalize that function. And so that's why the center is really coming at a critical time.
Zeke, let me turn to you. And what are your thoughts as you hear this and sort of, I'm sure, have some of the same observation about, was this a function that we would have thought would have been there before?
It certainly should have been there before. And I think the glaring lack of data and analytics, the reliance by the United States on data and analytics from other countries, whether it's Israel or Britain or Singapore, was glaring early on. And so this is much needed and very helpful. I would say the big issue, I think, is the data side of things. And that is because the CDC actually can't command data and can't command people to submit data the way it should be able to. And so getting the right data, whether it's wastewater data, it's data on variants from excluded or excess plasma and blood, whether it's zoonotic data. That's going to be the real test here. And obviously funding. The initial funding was good, but not sufficient. It was, correct me if I'm wrong, Caitlin, $200 million. I mean, this is several $billion a year effort, I think, if we're going to get enough data and do the right surveillance.
Great. So let me ask Caitlin that question, that when you came in, some of the capacity here is really smart people like you and people who are really good, math nerds taking the data and coming up with forecasts. But some of it really is infrastructure. Some of it is the data streams that you need in order to then apply the analytics. So what did you find in terms of that data, and what is the center designed to do in terms of creating the right kind of data?
Yeah, Dr. Emanuel made a few really great points that I want to draw out. First is that we have a lot of growing to do in the United States with our public health data infrastructure. There's been about $1 billion appropriated to what is called the Data Modernization Initiative, which is going to upgrade that foundational public health data infrastructure. That's a great start. And certainly at the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, we'll be able to make use of that. But there is another issue here that Dr. Emanuel touched on, which is that right now the CDC can't compel or require data reporting from jurisdictions. It's all shared voluntarily. And that can be a pinch point, especially in an emergency when things are moving very quickly. And so I think that's an opportunity for growth there. The last thing I want to say about data is that there's the foundational public health data that jurisdictions and healthcare facilities report routinely, but there's also always emerging questions in an outbreak that we need answers to quickly. And so as part of our capabilities at the Center for Forecasting, we will be maintaining the capabilities to go out and conduct the studies to collect that data. And I'll just briefly share one success we've had in that realm already. Very early in the Omicron outbreak, we had heard from colleagues in South Africa that it was causing more mild disease than the Delta variant, but we were actually able to partner with Kaiser Permanente and UC Berkeley to use the KP data to compare Omicron severity to Delta, and it was the first US estimate of Omicron severity. And so that's the kind of thing we want to be able to do a lot more of.
So maybe getting a little more deeply into Zeke's question, Caitlin, nobody ever spends on prevention, whether it's at a societal level or a personal level, until there's a threat. So it's sort of natural that we, since the last pandemic, really the sort of global pandemic of this magnitude was 100 years ago. It's not that surprising. But then you do look at the UK and you do look at Israel and some other countries, and it seemed like they did have the data, they did have the infrastructure to answer these questions in ways that we didn't. And they also had not really suffered the same kind of threat. So what do you think that was about? Is it just that the health system was designed differently, or Israel so much smaller and everybody's in a few HMOs? Why did they have this wired better than we did?
Well, I dispute a little bit that these are uncommon events, because if you look at what happened in the 21st century, it's been SARS, Zika, the anthrax attacks, Ebola, COVID. Like, it's about every 2 years that we have these major health threats that actually threaten our national security. And so I think we need to start looking at it not as something that comes around once every 100 years, but the way that we talk about hurricanes or the military, where we know we need to make those investments because the threat will come, and it's really on us to be prepared. Now, I think what you're describing is of how our international colleagues have been so successful in generating the data and analytics to guide their own domestic response is part of what we want to do here in the United States. Now, we don't have a national health system, and that is the foundation for a lot of the data streams that our partners were able to produce, but there is more growing that we can do, and so that's part of the investment we're making at the Center for Forecasting.
Great.
I find that question, Bob, I find that question a little strange from someone in San Francisco sitting on an earthquake fault line. Because, look, it's going to happen sometime.
Of course.
We can take preventative action. And the fact that we know, which you are 100% right, there is a natural human tendency to not invest in prevention and underinvest in it, especially if it costs money. We know that personally, right? When we took copays off of preventative tests like cancer screenings and preventative services, we actually use them more. Knowing that tendency, we should counteract it because it's not new. We can't claim we didn't know about it. But I would also point out in Taiwan and South Korea and Japan, they actually responded to SARS in 2003, 2004 much differently than we did. We wanted to see, and we weren't directly affected, right? It was more Canada than us. We wanted to see it in our back mirror. They were scared out of their minds about it, and they were suspicious of China. They hired epidemiologists, they hired infectious disease doctors, they improved their ability to collect data systematically and monitoring what was happening in China so that they weren't going to be surprised and they weren't relying on the Chinese government. We are a big country. We have a lot of resources. We should do that too. And the idea that as a country, Caitlin noted, we got $1 billion here. $1 billion. Let's remind ourselves that's $3 per American. That's not the kind of prevention we should be investing in. We really need to recognize $30, $40, $50 per person is the kind of dollars per year that makes a lot of sense.
And Zeke, what's your take on why, let's say, the UK has been better at this than we have? Is it simply a National Health Service? And because I can tell you, having worked on their digital systems, they're not any more advanced than ours are. But is it just the fragmentation of the American healthcare system versus a more cohesive, centralized system? Or is it something about culture and prevention that they pay more attention to it than we tend to?
No, I don't think it's actually the health system. And maybe Caitlin will disagree. I actually think it's a political issue. We have federalism. We have a system where it's not the federal government which commands, whereas there, England, Wales, and Scotland, you got 3 places, and you do have much more out of London. London will tell you what's happening. We could have the same. After all, in public health, it's the CDC which is sending out those checks to almost all the states and localities to do much of their public health. We could say, in exchange for this check we're sending you to support, we would we want the following materials, and it's a quid pro quo. And I think that is the way we should do it. We did that with drunk driving. It made a huge difference. We should do it with public health data.
Great. I'm sure that wouldn't be controversial at all. Caitlin, how should we be monitoring the state of the pandemic today, particularly as case testing is less reliable than it was because of home testing?
Yeah, it's true. Home testing is really changing the case reporting. And we also see that many jurisdictions are choosing to go to less frequent reporting anyways. So it continues to be the case, or it is newly the case, I suppose, that the primary metric is more along the lines of hospitalizations and deaths. But one thing I want to raise is that the reporting, particularly of hospital capacity, is actually tied to the public health emergency declaration. And so when that declaration goes away, that reporting will become voluntary. And so I think that's an underexplored element of how our ability to track the pandemic is shifting. But for the person following along at home and wanting to know what's happening in their community, I think that continuing to visit your local county or state public health site to look at the metrics that they have there. Many jurisdictions have done a lot to make those digestible, to bring colors to them so that you understand where you are on the spectrum. That's still how I track the pandemic in my community.
So I pushed back slightly on hospitalization because A, it's not going to start going up for 2 weeks after there's already a problem. And B, at some level I care because I work in a hospital and I don't want people to be sick and die. But at some level, the question I'm asking every day about whether I bring a mask out with me in the same way I'm bringing an umbrella out is what are the chances that the person standing next to me in line at the Safeway is infected? Hospitalization tells me nothing about that. So I can tell you the number that I use, which I'm privy to, but others are not, is UCSF Medical Center tests asymptomatic patients when they come in for their colonoscopy and their cabin. So it's essentially random surveillance of a population. And right now it's about 1% positive. And I use that and I say, all right, there's probably 1 out of 100 people who I'm going to come in contact with at the restaurant who actually have COVID, probably don't know it. And that helps me make my decision making about whether I'm going to the restaurant, whether wear a mask. So do we need more routine surveillance of the general population? What's the role of wastewater in that? Because I'm still a little skeptical that hospitalization is going to get us the information we really need to make decisions.
Well, hospitalizations is what we have. And so that's sort of the frame that I was bringing is like, what do people in most communities have available to them to understand what's happening? I think if we were to design the next generation system, if we were to think about how else we might do it, the UK has done a lot with random sampling and it has brought enormous value to the international community with the insights that they've generated. They've actually just recently scaled that program back. And so I think they're going through a lot of the same thinking that we are of like, what does the next phase of pandemic surveillance look like? So I think that there is certainly a role for that kind of randomized sampling. And I think wastewater too is a really neat opportunity. Personally, I haven't gotten in the cadence of understanding what it means and how to track it and how to correlate it with all the other insights. And so I think there's more work to be done on understanding what it all means, but it's clear that it's an emerging leading indicator. And so I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah. Zeke, what do you think about monitoring? Yeah, go ahead.
One other issue with advantage of wastewater monitoring is that it doesn't depend upon the proclivity of people to get tested or the ability of them to interact with the system that will get them tested. It's very passive on the population part. Its problem is it's not standardized, it's not representative of the whole country. And I think those are the things that, again, a federal investment is needed to solve and very urgently, because I do think that's probably in the long run going to be our best monitoring system.
Wastewater is. So you wouldn't, in terms of a big investment in routine surveillance and those sort of things, less pressing, you think?
Yeah, wastewater is likely to be better from a long-term standpoint in the prevention system. Yeah.
Okay. So Caitlin, we talked sort of about policy issues in monitoring. Let's talk about the real world today. What's your sense of the state of the pandemic? David Leonhardt's column yesterday talked about we're not sure why we haven't seen a surge, and Mike Osterholm said, I really don't know. We should have seen one by now because of BA2. We haven't. Not sure why. What's your sense of what's going on and what's likely to go on in the next month or two?
Well, I live in Maryland and we are starting to see our improving trends reverse. Things are getting a little bit worse and I expect that's attributable to BA2. And so I wouldn't rule out yet that we'll have a little bit of a bump. Beyond that, I don't foresee a large wave, which I take a little bit of comfort in. But with this virus, it seems like you never know because things are always changing. But it does seem like we're in a period of relative quiet right now. And I hope it sticks around.
And why don't you see a large wave? You would think that if the conditions of if your immunity came from your vaccines, they're waning, and very few people have gotten their first booster. Few people now are getting their second. We'll talk about that later. If you got your immunity from Omicron, that I assume is waning and will wane more. And everybody seems to be playing like it's 2019 in terms of ditching the mask and going back to quote normal. So why wouldn't we just be a setup to get hammered again?
Well, the Omicron wave was relatively recent, and so I wouldn't rule that out as conferring broad population immunity. I think that the role of behavior is going to vary a lot from community to community, particularly at this stage of the pandemic. But in my area in Maryland, people are still, some of them, wearing masks and moving to outdoor activities. And so I think it's always a constellation of changes to the virus, the population immunity to behavior, but I think there is a lot to tease out, not just with our current phase of the pandemic, but across the scope of the pandemic of why we've seen the patterns that we have. And I think a lot of dissertations are going to be written about that.
Yeah. Zeke, what's your sense of where we are and where we're going in the next few months, let's say?
I'm with Caitlin. I do think we're going to have a surge. I think what we don't know is how high that surge is. You can look at places that have done well, Massachusetts, New York, and they are pretty rapidly increasing. And the wastewater tells you also that it's going up. So I think there's going to be a surge. I'm not sure how high. I think the one saving grace in that is we are in April. While it's a cold April, at least here on the East Coast, it will warm up in May pretty reliably. San Francisco will probably get colder, but in the East Coast, it's going to get warmer. And I think we'll go outside, and that'll probably squash that surge. But I do think there's a reasonably high likelihood that sometime in the fall, late fall, we're likely to have another surge, another variant of concern. I would put it at under 50%, but over 25%, something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's what worries me, because I know at my university, we're getting rid of masks. They're still required in classroom, but walking on the walkway where it's pretty crowded, people are maskless. That tells students that the norm is you don't have to wear masks. And so excluding classroom, you see a lot of it coming off. And I think as we go inside in the fall, we bring everyone together from around the country and around the world, because people are cooped up and they're going to travel. We're going to have a pretty surge. And I keep telling my administration, I would prepare. If that's the contingency I worry about, and I would prepare for that. I don't know whether they're going to listen to me, but that would be my, I think that's the fear I have, because people are going to be tired. They're going to have gotten used to not wearing masks. And then it's going to be, blam, we're going to have a surge. And I don't know that we really know how people will respond to that. I think they're going to be quite difficult to get them to do the public health measures we want them to do.
Yeah, I mean, here in San Francisco, people have been incredibly careful, and the death rate is 1/4 the national average, and there's some natural advantage we have, but most of that probably is behavior, both vaccines and masking and stuff like that. And my sense is people would go back, but my sense is the rest of the country mostly wouldn't. And so how does that you think that'll change the nature of what otherwise we saw? You see a surge, people change their behavior, it comes down. We may see a surge and people will not change their behavior, at least in certain regions. Is that what you think is likely to happen?
That's my worry.
Yeah.
So this gets to a larger issue, which is we're now 25 months into this thing, almost exactly. And I think we've now discovered that's the limit. That's the limit. People are going to, radically change their behavior, their social interactions, et cetera. And then they really become stir crazy. And I don't know what that 2-year limit is. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if it's biologic, et cetera. But my worry is exactly that. Once we've gotten through it, people aren't going back.
Yeah. Caitlin, we talked a little bit about variants. We've heard about a couple new ones in the last few weeks. Is that part of your center's job to be monitoring them and figuring out, is this a big deal or a nothing burger? And if so, what are you thinking about the ones that have emerged in the last couple of weeks?
Certainly, it's the responsibility of CDC, and the Advanced Molecular Diagnostics Division is really the lead for genomic surveillance and characterization. Where we will come in, where our capabilities will grow, is to be able to do some scenario modeling and say, if this becomes established in the United States, or if it becomes dominant, what could we expect with our trajectory? And we were able to do that actually very early in December with Omicron, and foresaw the large wave that came to pass. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really helpful for allowing decision makers to look around the corner and to do a little advanced planning, which is really important when you're trying to get ahead of an outbreak.
So Zeke gave us a less than 50% and more than 25% chance of some new nasty coming out in the next 6 months. Do you have any sense of the probability of that when you and your colleagues do this kind of modeling?
I sure don't, but we've seen variants. We've seen them over and over again. And so I think it's wise to be prepared and to imagine what we would do under various planning scenarios, which is underway. But that's really the way to think about it, I think, is almost like the Department of Defense approaches planning. There are scenarios for everything, and they are on the shelf and they are ready to go when they're needed. And I think that's the way that we need to think about not just COVID response, but public health response generally. I will say too that Zeke said something that gave me pause. which is not knowing the size of the BA2 wave. The UK has actually had a fairly substantial BA2 wave, and they usually precede us by a couple weeks to a month. And so that gives me pause that it might be more than I want to see.
And Zeke, you're not the forecaster of the two people on here or the three people on here, but you wrote a piece, I think a couple of months ago, on what you thought China was going to get hammered. And I remember reading it and saying, what makes him think that? China has, once, the first month went by, they figured out how to lock this down and they haven't had any threat at all. And lo and behold, 2 months later, they're getting hammered. How did you know that?
Yeah, I can't do anything like the modeling that Caitlin can do. And so mine is all back of the envelope, crude calculation. But as you know, Bob, I've made a career out of those crude calculations. So actually, the irony is that article was published January 25th, and it was submitted 2 or 3 weeks before that. We made the prediction. And I think the prediction was based upon the idea that Omicron was going to outrun your ability to detect it, the Chinese ability to detect it, and people were going to be moving between cities faster than they were going to be able to lock down people, and therefore it would explode. Secondly, their vaccine well nigh worthless in preventing anything, so all the vaccinations they did weren't very relevant to population immunity. Third, they had no population immunity from infection. And fourth, their health system couldn't accommodate this because of the way it's structured around hospitals, and that there's no really effective outpatient care giving. So you would create lots of people going to hospitals, and that would just exacerbate the problem. So that was the thinking that I brought to bear to sort of project this. It took a couple of months for us to be borne out, but it's there now, and it's certainly hurting Shanghai pretty badly, and I think it's going to hurt the central administration. I would say, the political side of this is people need to realize Xi is, everything for Xi is October. That's when he gets reelected to the third term, or not. And so he just wants everything to be quiet until October. And so I think there's been a lot of, let's not pay attention to it. Let's not publicize these things. Let's not take big preventative measures until he's forced to. And that's the lockdown situation.
Yeah. Wow.
I think that also exacerbates things.
You think the lockdown exacerbates? Obviously it exacerbates.
No, I think let's keep it under the radar.
Right. Right.
The keeping it under the radar allows it to explode because people are still moving around, sure, and are still seeing others doing Lunar New Year type events and things like that.
Well, I was very impressed because I didn't see that coming, and the fact that you got it right makes me want to reach out to you for stock tips. I thought that was pretty amazing. So Zeke, let's turn to you and Caitlin. I'll sort of pitch some in your direction, but this is going to get more political, and because you're now a CDC employee, you may need to turn off your camera periodically. Zeke, you were part of the Biden administration's transition team as a very smart group of people helping to advise on the COVID response. So, how would you grade the administration's COVID response?
Well, I think the first 6 months, they did fantastically well. They focused on getting the vaccine out there, ramping up production, persuading people to go out. And I think that was quite effective. And I think they have to be commended on it. And then I think sometime over the summer, lost their way, took their eye off the ball. They didn't with that success, rethink, well, now where do we have to go, and do a sort of comprehensive re-strategizing. Instead, there was this we've got a lot of people vaccinated. We were third in the world at that point. The numbers were down in the basement. Many of you may remember last June. I certainly remember because I took the first trip I had taken in 18 months. I think everyone breathed a sigh of relief, the famous, freedom from the virus kind of thing. And then Delta hit. And I think that was eminently predictable, not that it would hit it, August, September, but that something was going to come in some variant, and it was going to be And I don't think we had sort of put into place the strategic plan we needed for the next phase. So I think that's what was the slip up.
And I guess there are two things that happened that were surprising. One was Delta, as you say, it wasn't that surprising. There would be a bad variant, but who knew when and what its probability was. Second thing was surprising, and again, maybe for you not surprising, was the politicization of the vaccine response, and not just the mass response, and at some level, even as I say that was surprising, like, why was that surprising? We've politicized everything, but did that surprise you at all, the way the country sort of divided into camps on both masks and vaccines?
Not really, and I think former President Trump could have alleviated that a lot. Had he intervened very early and had he taken credit for creating the vaccine and getting it to, the point of mass distribution, he didn't, and he hid behind not revealing his vaccination status. And then only when there was sort of political turmoil inside the Republicans and he thought he could gain some advantage politically from it, did he sort of push hard and push back against people like DeSantis. That was a terrible missed opportunity for the country to sort of come together about this. But I do think, Bob, you're essentially right, which is the political divide is overshadowing everything. And you would have thought that this was an emergency. We could have brought the country together around this, like the way we did in World War II or the way we did on space or whatever unifying item. This was a serious threat, and yet it just divided us further. And that, I think, is a very, very ominous commentary on where we're at, that even something that should be able to unite the country didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see it playing out today with the war as well. I'd love you to talk about two weighty decisions that I mean, you're in a unique position, having been in the room where it happens in two administrations. You have a brother who was the chief of staff to a president. You kind of know how this all works. So the decision about the second booster and the decision that they're grappling with now about whether I need to wear a mask on an airplane I'm flying tonight. Hard decisions. There's science, there's politics, there's everything. How do those decisions get made? What do we not understand about the sausage factory for decisions like that?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because I'm actually in the midst of teaching a course which is entitled How Washington Really Works. These, typically there are political aspects to it and policy aspects to it. And when they're made well, you have to marry the two. And they often do depend, and I emphasize this, they do depend a lot on who's in the room, who's making the arguments, how the arguments are being made. Typically, and I know in this administration, they care what's the best policy. They want to know, what would the policy experts recommend? What can we do? And then they have to balance that against what's feasible for the country to get behind. And I will just tell you that as we were going through a lot of this, like you, I was called by a number of political leaders, governors of states, mayors, and you give them a recommendation, they say, can't do it, the public's not there, I can issue that recommendation on masking or restaurants or whatever, but the public won't follow, and therefore I won't issue it because it will undercut my credibility and undercut the political capital I need for some subsequent set of recommendations on this. And I think we as policy experts or scientists often miss that sense and that important currency of political relevance and leadership. And I do think that's something that the politicians, good politicians have. And I think actually you can see that President Biden do this, for example, around the vaccine, trying, make it available, make it free, make it provide incentives, do all sorts of things and show that you can get so much, but you can't get enough. And only then, again, with some outside cover by people like me, only then begin to go to mandates and requirements in particular sectors like the government employees, like the VA, et cetera. And I think that was a wise political move to show, look, we're trying everything and we're being forced by the circumstances to move to requirements. That's the kind of thing a politician does. And that's where the politics and the policy overlap. I think when you come to fourth boosters,
second boosters, fourth shot.
Fourth shot, sorry. Fourth shot. I actually don't like to say boosters for the reason that we don't know what the optimal sequence here is. You know, it's like I was just working on, right before this, working on thinking about the malaria vaccines that the WHO has just endorsed for Africa. It's a 4-shot sequence. You know, really, we don't know whether, you know, the COVID vaccine ought to be a 3-shot sequence, a 4-shot sequence, which various vaccines ought to be sequenced to get optimal duration and immunogenicity. So I think, you know, the 4th shot, I think they want to prevent a surge, and they want that 4th shot, and they want to actually prevent older people from getting sick. And that's what's motivating them. I think the confusion and is the data really there that the public is feeling is quite legitimate. And I can't tell, I don't know what you're hearing, but every day I get 3 or 4 people asking me, well, should I get a shot? When should I get a shot? How do I think about the shot? It's very confusing to people. And I think that's been a big problem around this one. I think you're going to get very low uptake because people are not confident that it's the right move or when it would be the right move. And the fact that the protection seems to last very, very short, I think also has people uneasy, as if they've got one card to play and they don't want to play it too early. They want to play it just at the right time to protect themselves.
I have a Twitter thread on all of this coming out in a couple hours. So it's a
I'll
really
pay attention to that.
It's a tough call.
You're so organized that you have
any comments on? I understand you're limited on what you're comfortable saying in terms about the CDC, but sort of you were an outside academic like Zeke and me, and now you're seeing it from the inside. Any observations you have about the way policy is made that you didn't understand 6 months ago or a year ago?
Well, I was on the outside, and then I worked on the transition team actually, and now I'm fully on the inside. And so actually one bit of career advice I would offer is for scientists who have an interest in weighing in on the policy process, you have to get the experience. I've learned, and I worked in the federal government even before I took my faculty position, but there's really nothing that can substitute being in the room and seeing how these decisions are made. And it really helps you to refine your science. And it also helps you to refine the way that you make recommendations and the way that you engage in those conversations in a way that's meaningful. And so I would absolutely encourage anyone who's interested in weighing in on policy and participating in that process to do it and to find opportunities to really get involved.
I would say that Caitlin's 100% right. Once you're involved in that process, you begin to ask slightly different questions.
Yes.
And I think it's the questions you ask that really get shaped by, well, how is this going to influence what people are thinking about? How's it going to be relevant and have impact? And I think that shaping those questions or having policy experience so it shapes the questions you ask is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about even the second booster decision or 4th shot decision is the framing of it is, are we talking about what's best at a policy level? And if you put it out there, you're going to confuse people, and some people who haven't gotten their first booster, that's more important, they should, and some people haven't gotten vaccinated in the first place. Now the idea that there are 4 shots, oh my God, I'm not even going to get started. Versus at the individual frame, and Zeke, you're an ethicist by training, where the individual frame is, I just want to make a risk-benefit decision for myself. And as far as I can tell, the risk of a vaccine is essentially 0. And the benefits are non-zero, so sure, I'll do it. So how do you sort of think about the policy public frame versus what's best for each individual? Because they're in tension all the time.
They are in tension all the time, and we are talking about public health in terms of vaccines. I would say that I think in general, up to 3 shots has been risk-free. The question of whether we've got immune exhaustion and things like that, whether we're shortening the period of protection because of repeated dosing, I think it is non-trivial. And while it may not be a risk in terms of an adverse event, it is a risk in terms of long-term protection. And I don't think we understand that enough. This is one of my big kvetches, as my grandmother would say, which is these are the things that NIH should have been studying and hasn't been studying. And I think we really do need some better information about those kinds of impacts. If we now want a fifth shot, are we going to get no response?
Let me just make clear to the audience, because there's a little shorthand here that people may, if they haven't been following the news, may not pick up. So a study came out yesterday from Israel in the New England Journal that showed that there was benefit to that second booster, but over the course of 2 months, the benefit for symptomatic infection had waned to zero, essentially. So rather than the 4 to 6 months you got out of booster number one, it seems like now for booster number two, you may only get a couple of months of benefit in terms of preventing a symptomatic infection, maybe a longer benefit, wasn't waning as quickly for a severe infection. So it sounds like that your worry is that maybe we have sort of boosted our way into exhausting the immune system, or at least we don't understand that very well.
Yeah, well, in terms of antibodies, now it may be different in terms of the cellular immunity, which I assume it actually is different, and that may be why we have some protection from more severe infection, longer lasting. But again, these are the kind of things we ought to have better answers than we do now. We have the world's best immunologists right here in the United States, but it does seem like we haven't prioritized understanding this in a deep way. And obviously you can't, in this situation, rely on the companies, because the companies have a financial interest in boost away every 6 months. Let's get another booster. And that's not, presumably, first of all, that's not who we want to be making the decision. And second of all, that's not going to be the right answer. That I can guarantee you, because you're not getting people boosting every 6 months. You might get people every year with their flu vaccine. But again, it's not clear that that's the right answer.
I think Zeke is making a really important point here, not that goes beyond the issue, which is that we need to think of research preparedness as part of our pandemic preparedness. So what are the studies? What are the data that we need to be prepared to go out and collect and to initiate that immediately? And we heard some good examples just now on immunology, but I also heard threads in how people are perceiving and choosing to take fourth doses or third doses or whatever. Like that's a whole social science research agenda. And I think that a lot of that has evolved organically through the traditional grant making process, but I think it could be a little bit more directed, and I think it could be a little bit more pre-planned, so that we know that we will have in hand the data we need to guide those decisions when the decisions come, and not too late.
Yeah. And I think the same thing could be said of, actually even worse said about long COVID. We still don't have a good study out of the United States that the NIH has funded on long COVID. And, we've known about long COVID now for 22 months.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I think the long COVID stuff in the last couple of months is pretty scary. I mean, what we knew about in long COVID for 2 years is that you can feel crummy for 6 months or a year. We didn't know that a year later, your risk of diabetes might be higher, your risk of a blood clot might be higher, your risk of a heart attack might be higher, your brain might be shrinking. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's coming out in the last 2 months, and essentially all of it is scarier, at least to me, than I thought 2 months ago. Is that your take as well?
Oh, absolutely. I've been pounding on this now for months and pushing the government on this, which is, look, we now know that if you have the boosters, your chance of dying, whatever, 1 in 30,000, some number like that. We don't know what your risk of long COVID is. We don't know how much the vaccine protects you, if it does protect you from getting long COVID. But if someone told me my chance of long COVID with the boosters is 1 in 10,000, 1 in 15,000, I would take the mask off and I would basically ignore COVID and live a normal, as if it were normal, right? The fact that, it might be as high as 10, 20, 30% of people who have an acute infection, and that it can be severely debilitating at a pretty high probability, I think that is dramatically changes the equation. And until we sort that out, I think it's, very hard to know what to do. And so I think it's absolutely essential. And the fact that we don't have answers to these questions and that we're not starting massive amounts of randomized trials, I understand. We don't understand the immunology. We don't understand the virology. Are there persistent virus? But trying things like SSRI inhibitors, immune modulators, steroids, statins, there's not much to lose with those drugs. We know how they work pretty well. And there are, if the GAO is right, millions of people suffering who really want treatments. Let's get started. And this, I do think, is another major failure of the NIH and not getting those studies rapidly up and running.
Caitlin, this may require you take off your CDC hat, get put back on your Hopkins hat. I interviewed when I was hosting in the bubble, and one of the things you did for the show was do safe or not safe and sort of opine about what you would recommend people do. So I don't know if you're still comfortable with doing that, but what is your take on the fourth booster? And I understand you may not be giving CDC policy, but your own take on whether, let's say, a healthy 65-year-old who has not had an infection to date and had their third shot 6 or 7 months ago, whether they should take it now and whether they should get the same shot they got or should mix to a different shot.
I emailed the older adults in my family and made sure that they knew that they were eligible. And so I did that. And so that's what which brings
I'm
me
sure
to
they all said, we watched the news, we know we're eligible. What should we do?
I don't think so. And that was actually where I was going to go next is I started doing this very purposefully. Like, you should know about that there are great treatments now. You should know about boosters, because it was well into November before I finally mentioned to my older adult family members, like, you got your booster, right? And they didn't know they were eligible because there was this phased rollout where first you were if you're immunocompromised, you could get a booster. And then if you were over a certain age, whatever. And so people just weren't keeping track when they did become eligible. And I thought I, as a public health professional, missed an opportunity here to make sure that people know that they're eligible. And so FYI, if you haven't reached out to the older adults in your life, like you should do that, because I think people are having a hard time keeping track.
Okay, but grandma calls you and says, thank you, should I get it?
Yeah, I wouldn't have sent it to her if I was like, but you shouldn't get it. So
okay,
yes.
Good.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear. And are you able to weigh in on the same shot versus the mix and match decision, which grandma also doesn't know what to do?
I haven't been tracking that closely, so I would see what Zeke thinks.
You have a back of the envelope on that one?
What I know is, or what I think I know, we started pushing the mRNA vaccines because they were readily available. They boosted the antibodies, they protected people. What I do know definitively is the current schedule is definitely not the optimal schedule. I can't tell you what the optimal schedule is, but giving one shot, 3 weeks later, another shot, or 4 weeks later, another shot, and then a booster 6 months later is almost assuredly the wrong schedule. From what we know in immunology, I used to practice immunology 40 years ago when I was right out of college. I was doing immunology research. Probably the J&J first is the right move, and an mRNA booster would be the right sequence. I can't say that definitively because we haven't done the trial, but that's probably the right thing. Prime the immune system broadly, and then give it a very focus on the spike protein. But again, we haven't done that, and I think that's a problem. So right now, I don't know whether you got 3 mRNA shots, which is my situation, and now going to a J&J. Will that be better, or will that be, we just don't know the answer to that question. So I think, my opinion is like throwing a spaghetti at a wall. What will I do?
There's a lot of inquiring people on the Q&A asking exactly what are you doing?
Well, so I'm not doing anything now. At the end of, and I'll be perfectly blunt, this is my life, okay? At the end of May, I have to go to France because my brother's getting married.
Which brother?
The youngest brother.
All right.
the ambassador is in Japan. He's, happily married.
All right.
The youngest brother's getting married in France, and then we're going on a trip after, right attached to that. So that's going to be a high risk moment. We're going to other countries, we're flying, blah, blah, blah. So 2 weeks before that, we will get boosted. And I'm thinking that we're going to get boosted with the J&J. Do I know that's the right answer? Absolutely not.
That's interesting.
What I don't like is the Israeli data that you just referred to.
Correct.
And that is getting me, that's making me think, I probably don't have anything to lose by getting the J&J and maybe have something to gain. That's the sort of, non-scientific. And now I'm talking like, one of my brothers who certainly is not a scientist. But that's, I think, where we're at in the absence of data.
Yeah. I got my second booster and just switched from Pfizer to Moderna, and did that before I read the Israeli study. But the Israeli study is, it was 4 Pfizer shots, and one wonders whether switching to something is a good call. I think we don't know.
Well, I think the difference between Pfizer and Moderna is probably just dose. I don't think it's a material mRNA that the Moderna mRNA is better than the Pfizer mRNA. I that's my suspicion. You've got dose and you've got timing, and that's the big difference between the two of them.
Yeah, for both, I'm just looking through the questions. We haven't talked anything about antivirals. So do you think that's a game changer in terms of the way you think about policy, Zeke, and what the government should be doing? And maybe Caitlin, about as you think about future pandemics and model what might happen, theoretically, if I have a sore throat and I test myself in the morning and I'm positive, and I can go out and get an antiviral that lowers my viral load, and I'm less likely, I guess, probably to infect somebody else. Does that change the way you think about the course of the pandemic? So Zeke, why don't you start with what do you think about them in general, and the implications for the pandemic and policy, and then we'll turn to Caitlin.
So when we were on the transition advisory board, I ended up with the therapeutics part of it. David Kessler said, you take therapeutics, everyone's focused on the vaccine.
Right.
And I quickly realized therapeutics was where it's at, in part because I didn't think, given all our history in the United States, we were going to get high enough vaccination rates. I did think that we were going to have people who couldn't be vaccinated. Being an oncologist, that was like a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. And I created a whole memo about that said, we should probably de-emphasize monoclonals. I had a big debate with the guys at Regeneron who were sure their monoclonal was not going to get resistance. It was quite clear that if you got a virus, you're going to have multiple antivirals, not just one. And here we are, whatever it is, 15 months later, we got, call it one oral antiviral. We've got 2, but you can't give it to pregnant women and lots of other restrictions. We're going to get resistance to it inevitably. And I do think this is an area we have to push very hard on. There are hundreds of oral agents in preclinical and clinical testing. And I think we need to get a multi-drug regimen that can be taken relatively quickly with a positive and have a big effect. And I think that would be, if we had that pill, like the COVID version of highly active antiretrovirals, that would make a very big difference. It would make a big difference for people who are immunocompromised and the vaccine doesn't work. It would make a big difference for breakthrough infections, et cetera. And it would decrease the chance, if we had 3 of them, that we would get we would get we would get viral resistance to the antivirals. And so I think that would make a very, very big difference in this country.
And so it sounds like you're not at all that enthusiastic about Paxlovid,
I am enthusiastic about it, but I'm very worried. Very enthusiastic. Yeah. Very worried that we're just going to breed resistance. And for all I know, it's probably out there already. We just haven't seen it and monitored carefully enough for it.
Yeah. Caitlin, any thoughts about the antivirals and how they impact what you think the future course is here?
Well, I do agree with everything that Zeke has said, but I have 2 concerns. One is around equity and access. In order to access those therapeutics, you need to get tested. And there remain, and in fact, are growing barriers to getting tested as we start to run out of money for that program. And so I think that the therapeutics are not available to everyone. And I think that's obviously going to diminish their impact. And then as an epidemiologist, it seems unlikely to me that therapeutics will decrease the burden of disease. And if we're not slowing or stopping transmission, then we're in a tight spot. And so I think it has to be all of the above. I think therapeutics are one of the tools in our toolbox, but they don't replace the pandemic strategy. Not that anyone is suggesting that, but just that I think it's a game changer for the better, but it's not going to change the way that we need to look at the pandemic, in my opinion.
Caitlin, why would they not decrease transmission if assuming people have access to them, the money's there, they can get tested? I get started on it today. If I get infected, wouldn't you expect that the rapid decrease in viral load would decrease the probability I'm going to infect somebody else?
Maybe marginally, but the bulk of your infectious period will be behind you by the time you get tested and by the time you access the therapeutics and by the time they work. I think that it's unlikely to do much on that perspective.
Yeah. Okay. And you both brought up that we need more funding, Zeke, several times. So obviously that's a hot issue today in Washington. So Zeke, why don't you game out the politics for us now? We're talking about a relatively small amount of funding, 10 or $15 billion. When I say that, it seems crazy, but in the grand scheme of things. And COVID funding has been relatively nonpartisan as things go up till now. And it seems maybe it's the same 2-year wall. Things can only be nonpartisan for so long, and then people got tired. But what do you think is the pathophysiology of what's going on in this particular debate?
Well, it's immigration, right? It's not COVID at the moment. And I think a large part of it is the sense, well, we're spent a lot of money on it. And did you guys actually spend it very well? That's the Republican question. We want an accounting, and we want to show where money hasn't been wisely spent or there's extra money. It's no doubt true that money that was sent to state and local governments on the assumption that they were going to have severe financial shortfalls went into their coffers, and in some places it was spent on things that it never should have been spent on. And I think that is bothersome. It should be bothersome to everyone where local governments, I think the Times had an article maybe 2-3 weeks ago about local communities spending it on minor league baseball parks. And it's like, wait a second, that's not what this money was about. And you also have a moment in time where states like California, like Texas, are actually awash in money. And why should the federal government be spending more rather than, cutting back on how much we're giving to states and localities? On the other hand, representatives are from states and localities, and they don't want that money withdrawn. So there's that politics around, how much should we be spending, where I think it's less about we need to make an investment in COVID, and COVID is become just this punching bag for these other debates about how much money should be going to states and localities. What are they spending it on? Were we responsible in what we gave them? Mm-hmm. But when we think through the kinds of things we need to do, beef up surveillance, get better vaccines in terms of mucosal vaccines, test out different kinds of vaccines, develop more therapeutics and run them very rapidly through clinical trials, improve indoor air quality, which is something we haven't spoken about. I'm quite passionate about, and I think is going to be very, very important. Beef up our public health infrastructure in other ways, especially in terms of personnel, and I think community health workers to get to the hard to reach communities. When you put all of that together, $10 billion is just a very, very tiny down payment. Again, I like to put it in account. That's $30 per American. Mm-hmm. That's just not the kind of money we need to be spending on something that hit the economy for $7 trillion and cost us, get federal government another $6 trillion. $100 billion spent on this in the next few years is not going to be money wasted. It's going to be money well invested in building infrastructure, improving indoor air quality on a long-term basis, et cetera. And that's really important.
In the same way, though, I wonder about the 2-year exhaustion at the individual level of, I'm ready to ditch my mask. Do you think Washington is exhausted and ready to move on and makes it less likely they'll make the kind of investment that you think they need?
I do think there's an element, not so much of time exhaustion here as issue exhaustion. You've got Ukraine, you've got inflation in the economy, you've got COVID, and we haven't even talked about all the other climate change, all the other issues that are really important. Mm-hmm. And I think Congress doesn't work well when it has multiple things like that to do, unless it has someone who can get those multiple things working together. You know, I like to spend a lot of time reading history, American political history. You know, you need someone like Lyndon Johnson who could put things in sequence. You know, in his first term after he got elected in '64, you know, within 9 months, he had 4 unbelievably path-breaking bills passed. We know about Medicare and Medicaid, but there's a higher education bill. There was an immigration bill. I mean, he is a guy who made lots of things happen quickly, and that was not a time of crisis. We need that kind of focused attention, and part of the problem is it's very hard to get that kind of focused attention in American politics today, and that's, I think, more of the problem than, you know, are we exhausted from COVID? We've got to attend to all these things, and that fragmentation of attention is, I think, more of a problem. And add on that we've just confirmed a Supreme Court justice and been through that process. You know, so I think, you know, we've got a lot of things going on, and Congress
And Lyndon Johnson didn't have Twitter to deal with, so or
if I could just tie together a couple of the threads that we've had too. Supplemental funding is absolutely critical to meet interim needs, but it's not a great way to grow capabilities, because when the money's gone, then everything you've invested in is not funded. And so as we think about supplemental funding, I also think we need to be talking more about the public health system that we want to build and grow towards, and how we can fund that sustainably. And I think that that's a part of the conversation that always needs to be refreshed too, because that is the cycle of panic and neglect that public health often falls into.
Absolutely.
I agree with you. And, you know, having served in the Office of Management and Budget, it tremendously frustrated me that, you know, most households and most businesses, you know, they have a capital expenditure and they have an operations expenditure. We don't in the federal government. And I think that's a big mistake. Yes, you've got to spend capital to build up infrastructure, build up personnel, et cetera, and then operationalize it. And I do think this annual appropriations process and budgeting process is a problem, and it makes our government much more inefficient. And then throw in on top of that, you know, these periodic government shutdowns. And I do think this is not any way to run a railroad. You know, you often hear in Washington by politicians pounding the table, we ought to run government like a business. Well, no business would run its budget the way the government runs its budget.
Yeah. We're at the hour, and you've been incredibly generous with your time and insights, and really an incredibly interesting and insightful hour from 2 people who are absolutely in the middle of the mix in all sorts of ways. So thank you so much for your time and your leadership, really, for the last 2 years and ongoing. I'm really grateful to you for being with us today. And thanks so much. Be well.